Princes and Priests. Chapter 3. The Grassland. The world was deadly silent as they slid and scrambled down the stony hillside to the grass below. Raven led the way, looking for the best path, putting his dwarven instinct to a small, comfortable test on this lone, steep mountain. At the foot of it, gravel and slabs of volcanic rock gave way to the grass. As he drew up to it, he felt his stomach grow cold. All his instincts told him not to go into the grass, but he had no choice. He pushed the fear down, took a deep breath, and boldly stepped out into the wall of blades and stalks. The thick fronds seemed to tangle around his legs and drag sharply against the exposed skin of his forearms. He felt suddenly as if he was being pulled at, crushed and suffocated. Shannon stepped up beside him, put a hand on his shoulder, and pulled him back a step. The sensation evaporated in a breath of cold that made him shiver. He looked up at the man in black, his eyes watering, his breath ragged.
"Wait,"
Shannon said softly. Catching his breath, Raven studied the tall man. Shannon was watching the horizon as the slowly rising sun lifted above the cloud bank. As the morning sun broke free, Shannon's face was bathed in golden light. The sunlight made Shannon flinch and squint into the brightness of it. The chill and unease vanished as if it was a mist hit by the first warmth of dawn. Shannon let go of Raven's shoulder and let the dwarf take lid again. He really was a striking man, Raven thought to himself as he walked out in the grass. It was no wonder that the elven word for beauty was rooted in the name of that man's race. Blue-eyed, black-haired Purtons were unrivaled in powers or appearance. It was almost a shame the race was nearly extinct, but civil war will do that to a people, no matter who they are. The grass was deeper than the dwarf had thought, well over his head, making him unable to lead. Oirion took the lead for him without comment. It was wet, but not as bad as Raven would have thought with the rain yesterday. It was still wet enough that they were all soaked almost immediately, none worse than the dwarf. He didn't complain, but kept up a fast pace. He didn't want to be in this grass any longer than he had to be. Even if the feeling was gone, he remembered it and was trying not to think about it too much. It hadn't even been a half an hour when Cindy began to complain and ask about taking a break. They tried their best to ignore her, but her insistent complaining only got worse and became as irritating as mosquitoes in the ear when you're trying to sleep. Shannon, however, was quickly tired of her voice, and his patience was not going to be spent listening to her all day. He stopped her, catching her arm roughly. Raven turned, expecting him to have a few sharp remarks for her, but Shannon didn't say a word.
"Don't touch me!"
she shrieked. The others stopped to see what he was doing. Shannon drew a long silver and pearl dagger from under his surcoat, and in one move slashed her skirts off, ripping them away and leaving her in her puffy white bloomers. She screamed as if it was her skin he had torn off. Theo lunged forward to save her, but Dave caught him in one arm.
"Don't,"
Dave said softly to Theo, likely saving the young man's life. Raven had the feeling it was death to attack that man, especially from behind. Shannon threw the mess of silk at Ivan and shoved the sobbing young woman forward, back into motion. Apparently, Shannon didn't like the grass either. Raven couldn't help but be a little amused at Shannon's abruptness and the woman's reaction to it, but glad for it. At least now she might shut up for a while. The lack of heavy silk would certainly make it easier for her to keep up.
"Don't be upset,"
Raven told the girl, moving her along and letting Ivan take his place in line behind Oirion.
"He did it to help you. He's just a little rough. Besides, it's only a dress, and a woman as lovely as you doesn't need such to be beautiful."
He might have agreed with Shannon about it, but he was still a priest. She smiled a little and then sagged against Theo. He put his hand on her back in a show of sympathy for her, but said nothing to offer comfort, nor did he seem overly upset. Dave shook his head and fell in motion once again.
"There was no need to be so hard on her,"
Oirion said to Shannon as he fell in step beside him.
"She's likely never even been out of a city before. Have a little understanding."
"It is important that we are out of the grass by dark, brother,"
Shannon said, visibly unconcerned for the girl's emotions and distracted from the party. His attention was directed forward, as if he was scanning for dangers.
Terrifying her won't help her keep up,
Oirion said, irritated at the tone and arrogance of the man for assuming they were equals. Few would even think of calling him brother. Revolves wanted to comment on the blade. They'd not seen it before and could have used it several times, but that seemed rather trivial to throw in just now. Now was not the time. Oirion had said enough already.
On the contrary, the more she fears me, the better I can keep her alive.
Revolves felt that Shannon spoke with more meaning than his words alone could express. As Oirion bit his lip to keep his cool, Revolves could see Oirion struggling to not fall into a fight over proper behavior. Oirion wasn't so petty as to fight over what title a man used to address him or how to treat silly girls, but he wanted to. Revolves couldn't help but wonder if the stress and situation here made Oirion more particular or less. It was hot and Dave was sweating profusely. He seemed to come out of a daze. Wiping his brow on his sleeve, he looked around. He was walking along behind Theo at a hard, fast pace. The sun was high in the sky, making it hotter out here than it had been on the mountain, but no one talked or complained as they began to climb up another large hill. They just kept moving. The pace they were keeping was impressive, but no one was panting or grunting, just marching blank-faced and fast. Dave began to question how this was possible. The priests might be able to do this, but the rest of them were not trained for this sort of work. Certainly not Cindy or Theo. Dave knew he was strong, but he was a sailor and had no illusions that he could walk at this pace all day. His strength was in his upper body, not his legs. Looking around past the company, he could see the hills rolling back progressively smaller as they went out to meet the ocean. The lone mountain they had used as refuge for a month rose up, a blue peak of stone far back and to the east of them now. Here in the rocky gullies, a few trees were growing, and although the hills blocked their view, the mountains before them sent a cool, sweet breath of wind at them. He marveled at the distance they had gone, but he wasn't completely surprised. He'd seen this sort of thing before. All the sailors knew that when Shannon was on board, they could face the worst storm and not get tired, no matter how long the storm lasted or how far they went. Even with that skill, the recent storm had driven them into the rocks, and they could not escape. Once, years ago, Dave had asked his uncle how he was able to keep the men from getting tired. Shannon had said that he took their fear and turned it into strength.
"Doesn't that make you tired?"
Dave had asked.
Yes, it does, but not for the reasons that you might think,
He had said. Dave had always wondered what that meant, but never asked for more details. He feared he might have gotten answers he did not care to hear. Dave looked for Shannon now, and saw that the man was walking parallel to them, his head bowed as if he was searching the ground for something. Shannon always knew when someone was looking at him, and he raised his head to meet Dave's eyes. Dave felt that odd rush of fear mixed with excitement that a man usually only feels when he challenges death and survives. He quickly looked back to his own path. He didn't want to think of his uncle as death, but at times he wondered. He had no doubts that Shannon was keeping them moving, and he didn't want to weary the man any more than he had to. He relaxed and let his mind drift back under the sleepy influence of the spell. As he did, he wondered if Shannon had let him wake up so that he could see and know the truth. Dave wondered how it was that the two priests had fallen under the spell as well. Were they that tired, or was Shannon that powerful? As the sun began to sink below the horizon, they approached the wall of trees, marking the end of the grass and the start of the forested mountain. Stone replaced the hard dirt, and a thick moss replaced the grass. The grayish-green moss was the only abundant undergrowth here. The trees were tall and massive. Their boughs reached out, creating a canopy of needles. Massive roots split the stones, making a jagged landscape. The sweet pine and earth fragrance of the forest was a welcome change after the cold, salty smells of the ocean air and hot grasslands. Dave drew a deep breath in response to the new freshness, thankful that they had made it, his mind clearing into wakefulness.
Look back,
Shannon said softly to Dave as he stepped past him. Dave turned to look at the grass. The two priests glanced at each other and then looked back as well. Dave blinked and let the sight rise up into his vision. There was the trail, quite easily seen before him. Swirls of gold, lavender, and pink hung like perfumes over the golden footprints on the ground. Parallel to it, where Shannon had walked, was a dark trail that looked as if the grass along it had been frost-burned hard enough to shrivel and turn the blades black. As he stood looking at the grass, the brilliant sun went down. The grass began to move, even though there was no wind. Revan inhaled sharply as he saw what was out there. The grass began to reach for the energy trail. Each blade waved through the residue, then curled in on itself like barnacles reaching and grabbing at food in the world around it. The thousands of blades moved like some underwater monster as it devoured the trail, folding in on it and then curling back. The grass that was burned in Shannon's wake, however, lay still. Black steam seemed to rise out of the broken dead stems. Dave watched in horror as the grass next to the burned blades reached out, tearing and pulling at the damaged stalks. It was actually eating it. Not just the energy was devoured, but the fibers as well, until there was nothing left but a trail of exposed ground.
What is it?
Dave asked in disbelief. He now knew why there was no life in the grass. The grass ate the energy, ate anything out there. He imagined the hell of being out there now, the grass turning into feeding leeches and sucking all life from a creature. He shuddered at the idea. It was like a nightmare come real. Shannon had to have known. That was why he had made them come so far in one day, and why he had risked his magic being detected by the priests.
We had heard of it, but I never thought I would see anything like it,
Revan said.
Jamie, you'd love this one.
Oirion muttered.
Carnivorous grass.
The young wizard and the two priests turned to find that Shannon had led the others farther up the mountain and away from the grassland. They clambered up after them, feeling a little uneasy at turning their backs on the deadly expanse. In a clearing, the others stood around waiting, waking from the day's trance.
I suggest that we keep moving,
Revan said, as he reached the people in the clearing. He didn't think that he could sleep this close to the grass, now that he knew what it was. He envisioned one of the party members getting up to relieve himself, stumbling into the grass and the death it promised.
Is anyone too tired?
Oirion asked, no more eager to stay than the dwarf. Everyone looked around, but no one said anything, not even Cindy. She started to, but one look from Shannon, and she went silent, half hiding behind Theo. That lack of fatigue worried Oirion, but he put it out of his mind. If they had stopped to rest even once, they would be out there right now. The idea made him ill. They didn't make it far before the long hike began to take its toll. They started to stumble and fall, the dark making it only worse. Revan called a rest. Everyone dropped to the ground and didn't get up. They lay back, aching and exhausted. Something had carried them through that hell. He closed his eyes and prayed thanks to God for his aid, and blessed the angels that had helped them get through it. They slept late, waking up sore and stiff. Even Raven felt the strain of the hike. He stretched, watching Oirion do the same. For a moment, he almost asked Oirion where Father James was, but decided against it. If Oirion had wanted to talk of the man, he would have by now. Whatever was going on was nothing Oirion chose to share. It was a risk to have a partner. Sometimes bonds went bad, and even men as famous as those two might have had trouble with it. Breakfast promised to be the last of the supplies, down to the final crumbles in the tin of nuts. Fortunately, Shannon appeared with 3 little rabbit-like creatures that he handed to Tavia. She set to work at once preparing and cooking them. The extra rest was welcomed, and the food even more so. Tavia brought a portion of the hot meat to where Shannon stood, just at the edge of the camp. He was watching a little trickle of water that escaped the broken stone and then vanished again.
You need to eat,
she said. He had eaten less than anyone, yet provided more than anyone. More often than not, he declined meals that he scavenged up, and this time was no different. He turned those pert eyes on her. He said nothing for a moment, expecting her to just fall back, she suspected, but she had grown up with powerful eyes all around her and was not put off so easily. Shannon clearly had power, but he was not malicious or cruel, only haunted and ancient. How the others could not see that, she did not know.
I ate.
He said in the soft whisper of the Pertan nobility, still used by those old enough to recall the empire as it once was.
I don't believe that.
Tavia told him.
Not even a Pertan can keep going on what you eat.
He put his gloved hand on hers, pushing the little bowl of meat away, and went back to his focus on the little trickle of water at the camp's edge.
If I ate that now, it would make me ill. Give it to the others. I will not eat it.
She almost wanted to argue, but he was probably right. He'd eaten so little, the greasy little rodents would likely turn his stomach. She relented and turned, deciding on who should get it. She settled on Theo, slipping over while Cindy stared at Ivan. Ivan was telling her about the city of Jakarta, where he had a coastal palace. Theo looked up from rubbing his sore legs and saw Tavia holding out the bowl of meat. He took it and whispered,
"Thank you."
He was starving, usually giving his food to his wife. He had been thin to start with, and now he looked ill. Raven said a prayer as they each drained the last drops of the watered wine they had carried. As they finished their meal and fixed their boots, Shannon patiently filled their canteens from the trickle coming out of the stone. It was not sweet, as the mountain streams Tavia knew of, but was drinkable. She wondered if Shannon had put some sort of purifying spell on the water. There were no plants along the trickle, and that seemed ominous to her. She said nothing, but nodded her thanks to the man just in case. Raven took the lead as they headed up over the rough ground, southward, with no real idea where to go or what they would find.
Let's stop,
Oirion said to Raven. Raven was contentedly picking his way up over the new territory, nearly oblivious of the others. He looked back as they crawled up after him, strung out down the mountain.
This isn't a good place,
Oirion said.
There's a pond back there. We could run back down, see if we can catch something to eat tonight. Maybe get even to bathe.
Raven chuckled despite himself, but seriously considered the idea and the weary group. Ivan definitely had begun to smell after the sweaty hike the day before. The man was not even ashamed of his stench. He laughed and wafted his clothes, sharing the smell with a great chortle. It was wearing on Raven's already low tolerance of the man, and likely Oirion knew it.
Let's just cut over so it doesn't seem like we wasted the hike,
Raven said.
We'll stop for the day. Bathing would be good and they all need rest.
Oirion nodded and moved ahead to scan for trouble. He wanted to get to the water first to make sure it was clean. The trail cut sideways, dropping over a low ridge and winding back down, not that far from the others. Oirion stopped to watch them through the trees and saw Shannon bringing up the rear with a slow, even step, not at all labored. He followed behind Theo, who struggled and panted in the high altitude. The young man stopped to catch his breath, lifting his eyes up to the others ahead of him. Shannon stopped and waited for Theo, then looked over through the trees at Oirion. Oirion felt himself flush with energy that was out of place and uncomfortable. He felt an unlikely surge of violence toward the man, but turned and headed back down the slope toward the pond. The water was about 100 feet across with bushes along the far bank. A little stream drained into it from the mountain slope to the south. Oirion stood looking at it, his hands on his hips. The water looked clean and clear, but he wasn't so sure. He could scan that there were fish and what looked like a healthy ecosystem, as healthy as a warped territory could be, but he still felt unsure of it. Rushing into unknown waters was a bad idea anywhere, and certainly here was no different. Part of him just did not think it could be that easy. Raven led the group down to the pond as Oirion continued to study the water.
Hey!
Raven yelled at Ivan.
That pond might not be safe.
It's a damn pond,
said Ivan, already pulling off his armor as he strode for it.
Ivan, it's warped.
Dave objected, trotting down the slope at him.
You don't know what's in there. Let the priest scan it out first.
Ivan waded in, sloshing up to his waist. He turned around and waited with his hands on his hips.
Oh, look, it's fine,
he said, before he plunged in sideways, swimming out farther.
Ivan,
Shannon said firmly.
Get out of the water.
It was the loudest his voice had ever been. It wasn't that he shouted or dropped the whisper, but it was loud enough that Ivan heard him. He paused in his swim, as much surprised to have Shannon sound so firm, as for the fact that the man objected to the swim. He had thought Shannon fearless, and to have him show caution was nothing Ivan expected.
Why?
He had no time to get an answer as he was jerked under. Oirion moved to run for the pond. Shannon grabbed his arm, pulling him back with surprising strength. Dave was already down the slope and into the water. He dove in, barely leaving a ripple behind.
What the hell are you doing?
Oirion demanded, pulling free.
Ivan needs help.
2 men in the water are enough. Help in other ways.
Ravan already had his hands raised and threw a lance of blue-white power that hit the water surface, sending rings of shock outward from it. As the shock waves expanded, a shield that was hiding something in the water flickered. Ravan had another lance ready, this one of fire. He hurled it with his body and spirit. It shot through the air, hard and straight. Dave broke the surface, gasping hard. He coughed as he pulled Ivan up to get a breath. Ivan choked and sucked in some air, and then both were pulled under again. Oirion moved into the shallows and used a trick he had learned from Jamie, a lure. He bled out energy into the water with heat, added to fake a strong presence, drawing the attention off the smaller prey and onto him. The reaction he got was harder and faster than he expected. The monster rushed the shore and snapped. All Oirion saw as he leapt back was massive yellow teeth. He tried to escape the best he could with his feet in the mud, but teeth tore his vest and shirt, staggering him forward into the shallows again. The massive gray and black eel-like creature recoiled like a snake as Oirion lost his balance and plunged forward, his arms sinking into the mud. Oirion found himself chest-deep in mud, his head underwater. He rolled sideways hard, getting his head barely out of the water, but unable to get to his feet. He saw the thing coming down at him. The creature dove again with its mouth open, showing 100 teeth pointing in all directions. Its whole body was strong muscle, and its skin was sleek and dark. It moved faster than Oirion was able to. Before the thought fully hit him that he was about to be eaten, Shannon was over him with Ivan's sword. As the creature dove, Shannon swung. The thing's head came off, separating from its body at an angle, innards spilling out. The force of the creature's momentum carried it forward into Shannon. It impacted him, knocking him back. He tripped over Oirion, unable to catch himself in the soft, deep mud. Shannon hit the muddy water. Both men were drenched in the reeking blood and whatever else that spewed from the wound. Oirion gagged on the smell of it. Shannon and Oirion both had to struggle to get out from under the creature. Shannon got up and turned to Ivan, even as Dave was helping the big man out of the water. Ivan's pants were torn to shreds, and his legs were bleeding.
Do not ever do that again,
Shannon said. Dave moved as if to block Shannon from Ivan, but Shannon looked down at Oirion. He offered his hand to help Oirion, who was struggling a bit shakily to get to his feet.
And I said help, not make yourself into bait.
Once Oirion was on his feet, Shannon threw the sword, sinking it into the ground at Ivan's feet. Striding out into the water, he washed his face and then pulled his braid out and tried to scrub the filth out of his long hair. Oirion hadn't come that close to death in decades and was a bit rattled by the encounter. He went out as well, but not as far or deep to do the same.
It's nothing serious,
Tavia said, washing and binding Ivan's calves in the only bandages they had.
My pants are ruined.
He lamented, looking at them.
I got these in Kulta. Do you have any idea what these are worth?
Less than your life, I hope.
Dave muttered, picking at his own damaged pants. Ivan almost looked ready to cry. He looked up at Tavia, who was putting her little pack back into order.
Are you sure there will be no infection?
He asked, sounding like a worried child.
For a man who gets wounded for a living, you don't seem very at ease about it,
She said, too annoyed at him to sympathize.
Clean blades are not monster claws in a dirty lake.
He objected, looking at her with an odd expression.
Besides, why am I asking you? You probably aren't used to even dealing with men like me. I'm sure you're a little distracted.
Tavia jerked her pack closed and looked up with hard eyes.
Men like you, Ivan? You mean big and dumb? Well, no. I've never met anyone quite as impressive as you.
She stood, annoyed. Dave laughed.
It's okay to be flustered with your hands on my leg while I have no pants on,
Ivan said, as he got up. She rolled her eyes, then walked away to join her son, who was sitting with Theo under the nearest tree. Ivan flipped a crude gesture at her with his hips as she walked away.
Can you believe that woman?
He grunted to Dave.
She's probably never seen a man so well built.
Or so arrogant.
Riven said, amused by Tavia's lack of reaction to the big man.
Put it away, Ivan.
Ivan grunted and bent over to grab the tattered remains of his pants. He caught Cindy's eyes and winked at her, not the least bit modest about his nakedness. She smiled and dropped her eyes a little. Ivan's mood improved at once.
If she was half the woman Cindy is, then she would like me more,
he muttered. Dave shook his head and walked away. Ivan was impossible. Raven managed to catch a few fish from the stream that fed the pond. Tavia was seeing to the injuries while the others made camp. The fish weren't much, but they would start a meal at least. Shannon brought up a few wild onions and other herbs that made the oily fish meat edible. Turning down any of the meat, Shannon ate a few sprigs of various herbs, lifting them up to show Tavia when she started to complain about his lack of eating. Ivan started to grumble about the fish and the cook when oil dripped down on his embroidered vest, but this time Dave cut him off.
So, Ivan, how did a man from Dakan end up on the ship at all? I mean, Arwen's is a long way from there.
I was actually thinking about buying a place there. I heard of a pretty little place on an island off the coast and wanted to take a look. I always thought it would be nice to own my own island,
he said, forgetting his gripe from before.
What about you?
Dave asked Cindy, in order to avoid having to listen to Ivan brag about money. Cindy shifted and looked to Theo with an odd sort of expression, almost like panic, Dave thought.
We're just on holiday,
Theo said with a shrug.
escaping for a little, you know. What about you, Oirion? Why were you in Arwen's? I thought you patrolled Noyon mostly.
I was headed to Krish. The train to Valreen runs from there. The old northern east-west train shut down decades ago. It's the fastest way home.
He shrugged a little and took a sip of tea, considering that good enough.
Reven?
Dave asked.
I was headed to Kastava.
We weren't going to Kastava,
Dave said, a little perplexed.
I know, I got on the wrong ship. That's never happened to me before. Odd,
he muttered.
Me too,
Kelly said.
You were going to Kastava?
Cindy asked with a shocked squeak.
No, wrong ship. I was trying to get into Norwood, but the shield kept turning me around. Gave up.
She said with a shrug.
Why go to Norwood?
Dave asked.
Curiosity, I guess.
She said, but no one really believed her.
What about you, Shannon?
Ivan asked.
What put you on that ill-fated ship?
Shannon looked at the big man a long moment before he answered.
Bad timing.
I bet it was a woman.
Cindy said with a giggle.
Some forbidden love that he must slip away to be with.
I seriously doubt that.
Rivan said.
What about you, Tavia?
Just travel,
She said.
You're not wealthy enough to just travel.
Ivan said.
Really, woman, what were you doing on my ship?
Dave almost corrected Ivan. Only Dave could really claim the ship as his, and he'd never do that around his father. That would be a very bad idea. Tavia gave the big man a look of stone. She was not amused at him or his way of thinking.
She was moving,
Oirion said.
Leave it alone, Ivan. Some of us do not care to talk about our reasons for the trips we were on.
They settled down, and most were lost in their own thoughts until late. The quiet was ended when Cindy shoved Theo away from a whispered argument they had been having.
If you loved me, you would want to.
She stood up, huffing.
Maybe I'm not man enough for you,
She said with cruelty. She spun on her heel and stormed away. Theo shrank, miserable and unhappy.
Do you think there are any humans in these mountains?
Tavia asked, changing the subject.
It'd be nice to sleep in a bed.
It's too hard to say,
Oirion replied.
With all the unstable energy in the air, we can't scan very far that well. Chances are that any humans would be well shielded, hiding from the things that live here.
And maybe they have learned not to swim in strange ponds.
Dave said nicely. Ivan made a face at him. Raven couldn't help but chuckle. Dave had a twisted shoulder and a black eye from the encounter, but had sustained worse in games on deck.
If all you're going to do is harass me, I'll just leave.
Ivan got up too eagerly and left the little fire in the camp. Revan muttered something about wandering in the dark alone. He pushed himself up and followed.
Maybe he'll get eaten and we won't have to feed him anymore,
Tavia muttered. Theo smiled a little, overhearing. His eyes went after the big man who was striding away. He wasn't fooled. He knew his wife well enough to know it was arranged. It was the same old games she used at home. He'd not planned or expected her to be faithful, but he had at least hoped she would be discreet about her affairs. He tried not to think about the details of his slender wife being with massive Ivan. Relaxing back, Oirion leaned on his pack. He couldn't help but see Shannon through his half-closed eyes. The Purton sat with his back to the lone tree overhanging the camp, watching Travis play with a collection of stones and sticks. Oirion closed his eyes and pushed thoughts of Shannon out of his head. Oirion tried to pray, to calm his heart and settle the bad mood he was in. All that did, however, was bring up the grief that he felt was about to consume him. Frustrated and desperate not to break down, he sat up abruptly.
Dave,
He said,
you up for some sparring?
Sure.
Dave hopped to his feet.
I saw some pretty solid-looking branches back down the mountain a bit. Look for some staves, or you want to play with fists?
Staves sound better. We could use the weapons anyway.
Oirion followed the young sailor away from the camp and the fire. Theo watched the two men sparring with the staves they had gotten from the trees. Dave was obviously not a master at the staff like Oirion, but he was good, in spite of his twisted shoulder. Theo could see that Dave fought in a different style. Orion's weight was kept in the back in the current style of the Purton nobility. Dave kept his on the front foot in an older style. It was odd that the priest, who was supposed to be trained in ancient arts, was using a newer form of fighting than a sailor. Oirion was very good, obviously holding a great deal back. Theo had heard stories, of course, but to meet the man in person and see him spar was really very impressive. Travis, who was sitting with Theo, watched them a little while, and then went to find his own stick to play with. Theo glanced from Travis to Kelly. She looked from the sparring to Theo.
You fight?
She asked. He looked at her a moment, debating whether to tell her the truth or make up some easy lie about being too small for it. She nodded and looked back at them, leaning back on her elbow.
You know, in the elder days the sorcerers carried weapons,
She said in her soft, deep voice.
They could use them well. I have yet to meet one in these days who cares to carry a blade.
It was a strange topic and one that made Theo very uneasy. He shifted again and scratched at his attempt to grow a beard.
Why do you suppose that is?
He asked diplomatically, almost wanting to kick himself for saying it. This was not a good conversation. She looked back at him with soft, dark eyes.
I'm told it's because of the way energies ride on both metal and an edge. It makes spell casting very difficult for them.
I don't think that's it.
He spoke again before he realized that he was keeping the conversation going.
Oh, why then?
She asked him, seeming honestly curious about it. Theo shifted on the ground again and wondered if he was under some sort of spell that his usual shields were not detecting well enough. He rubbed his palm, feeling the power in the scar that he had carved there with a healer's knife. The scar was hard, meaning that it was working against something. So he was under some sort of spell that was encouraging him to talk to Kelly. How odd was that? The woman had barely said anything to him at all. If she was casting the spell, then she was in control of a power that she hid. It was a power that was most likely as illegal as his own. If that was the case, then maybe she knew what Theo was and wanted an ally should things go bad with the priests. He relaxed a little but added a whispered addition to his mental shields.
It's the energies of the metal blade,
he said.
It has nothing to do with the spells, it's just the fact that metal creates an unpleasant sensation. Like some people who wear certain jewelry and are allergic to it, causing them discomfort. Something like that.
He shrugged, trying to play casual. She nodded.
You should still wear one and learn to use it, especially in this country.
Right.
He nodded.
Maybe I will.
He wasn't going to tell her that he knew how to fight well enough, not great, but well enough in a pinch. He could kill when he had to, even if he had to resort to cheating. Thank you for listening. More chapters are available. Join our Patreon at patreon.com/2ravens801.